I'm Bryce Butler from Access Ventures, and this is More Than Profit, a show where I talk with founders, investors, entrepreneurs, and leaders of all kinds about living and working with purpose, how they do it, and why. This month on More Than Profit, we have a bit of a special deep dive, guest hosted by Ben Terry and TJ Aboud. We've all worked together for a while now at Access Ventures. Ben is the Chief Creative Officer, and in that capacity has overseen various creative endeavors from Visco Voices to now Hidden Ventures, an early stage venture strategy investing in better tools for creators. And TJ is the Chief Investment Officer at Access Ventures, where he spearheaded our thesis on blockchain and more specifically DeFi or decentralized finance back in 2017 and 2018. Given their expertise, they clearly are better positioned to have this discussion today, and I'm excited they're willing to step in.
Hi, welcome to this special recording of More Than Profit podcast. I'm Ben Terry, and I'm joined by TJ Aboud here at Access Ventures, and we're subbing in for Bryce this week to talk all things crypto, DAOs, NFTs, Web3, all the buzzwords you can think of as it relates to crypto. And we're excited to bring on someone who's been in the space for a while now, and that's Shawn Cheng. Shawn is actually an early stage investor and operator with a deep passion for frontier technologies. He follows all the weird rabbit holes to see what emerging tech is out there. He has previously worked at places like VaynerMedia, BBDO, Razorfish, and bridging startups and brands for 15 years. He's a Lego lover, he's a dad of 2 humans, and he's an Asian American advocate. Shawn brings so much depth of information and insight into the Web3 crypto space, and he's now currently a mesh partner, which is part of ConsenSys, where he handles portfolio management and focuses on their strategic initiatives like best-in-class partnerships, DAOs known as decentralized autonomous organizations, NFTs, which are those really cool JPEGs that you can buy digitally online, and the overarching blockchain space. So we brought Shawn onto this week's podcast mainly to try to make sense of everything that's happening in the Web3 world and what is Web3 even mean. So we go deep into all the details. So if this is your first time ever hearing about Web3 or DAOs or NFTs, this might feel like drinking out of a fire hydrant. But bear with us. We're going to give you some really great advice and tips. And the reasons we're really excited about this space is it is the one way in which we can provide more ownership and agency for the individuals as they participate in this internet world. And so we believe that that's an important part of Access Ventures' mission, which is to build a more inclusive and creative economy. And we believe blockchain technology helps enable that access and agency for individuals. And Shawn will demonstrate that more as he talks about community and participation in this upcoming frontier space. So to kick it off, let's have Shawn kind of break down what it is he does at ConsenSys.
Well, first off, thanks so much for having me. Really excited to kind of be on the pod and chat with you both on the latest and greatest with ConsenSys and ConsenSys Mesh. So my name is Shawn Cheng. I'm a partner at ConsenSys Mesh. I help to invest and build in Web3 technologies through a variety of different investment programs, as well as initiatives where we partner with the best in the space to be able to kind of further our interests and also the space's interests further and further. I originally joined about 4.5 years ago when we were just one company, and ConsenSys started as a venture production studio, which is more of a incubation-like model where we would hire the best and brightest people that were coming from the top of their industries, whether it was a consultant or a banking or a tech company or a startup or a venture firm. We tried our best to pull like-minded people, no matter what their background was, and brought them all to the same table and had a potluck. And that potluck basically generated some of the most interesting companies that I think our space has seen to date. Things like MetaMask and Infura and Truffle, and more recent ones like Attribute Labs, Gnosis, Infura, Gitcoin. And these days, I've been really focused on investment DAOs, and that's through kind of a lot of our restructure a year and a half ago, whereby which ConsenSys Software had really doubled down on working with large enterprises, multinational corporations, and sovereign nations to be able to really build products and services that address their needs. Whereas ConsenSys Mesh, which is a sister parent company that owns a portion of ConsenSys Software, continued the work of our incubator, our accelerator, which we're on our 6th cohort of right now, and then experimental investments in things like investment DAOs, which are decentralized autonomous organizations, or really software-driven organizations or internet-native organizations. And so these days we are continuing to deploy capital into the space that is working on that bleeding edge and finding the people that are deeply committed towards the implications of what this technology means for the world when it gets fully utilized and embraced.
I know on the website, it talks about the arrival of Web 3.0. And you kind of said that as well, like kind of like investing in companies or working with people in the Web 3.0. And then also has this quote, which I think is really interesting, from Joseph Lubin, kind of the founder, back in 2015, where he says, "In the mesh, everyone is a stakeholder working to help others succeed." Back in 2015, did you know of Web3? Or like, how are you all kind of describing that now? Because I feel like Web 3.0 is like very popular right now. So like, when was the arrival of Web 3.0 in the ConsenSys Mesh journey? How would you define that, or what shapes has it taken along the way?
That's a great question. And I think for a new industry that is building while at the same time defining the actual language, we ourselves have used probably terms such as crypto or Web3 or distributed ledger technologies, DLT, somewhat interchangeably, even though they have nuances to how they've been applied. And so when our company originally was born in 2015, it was born out of a vision of Joe Lubin and also Vitalik Buterin, some of the co-founders of Ethereum itself. And so as that protocol was launched, each of the co-founders and many of the earlier contributors really decided what they wanted to do with this new permissionless generalized technology. And so for ConsenSys, we've always seen many of those attributes as described by Vitalik as parts of how we might see ourselves. And Web3 definitely taking over the primary generalized term to reference and encapsulate many of the other new innovations within the broader space. Recently, I think, was a much more fitting term. So crypto broadly defining cryptocurrency, cryptography having key attributes around privacy and using things like cryptography and SHA-256 hashes and even how blockchains keep themselves decentralized and consensus mechanisms started with finance and started with money. But we all know, especially as of the last year, things like DeFi or decentralized finance have started to bleed into mainstream media, social media, influencer marketing, the internet, and start to touch the rest of the internet through mechanisms like non-fungible tokens or NFTs or DAOs, which are decentralized autonomous organizations. And those are long acronyms, really just to say that software and automation is coming through things that an individual can verify themselves. And so the ultimate outcome of how the language, I think, has panned out and started to embrace Web3 is very fitting, because I think just like the technology itself is ever evolving, I think the space also has attracted a variety of talent, and really having a bigger table that's much more diverse and brings many other stakeholders to the table is something that we really have really embraced. And so each turn, each bear and bull market, we have not shied away from leaning into many of the terms and the things that the rest of the ecosystem has started to coin, because with new technologies, I think people are always looking for new language to even describe or kind of combine creative assets or new primitives that we previously may not necessarily have seen, because it's hard to describe things that may not have existed before. So you end up borrowing a lot from the past, But in order to really take a leap forward, I think a lot of the innovators end up choosing to coin new phrases.
So on that, there's so much going on in the space, tons of nuance in the many different things you just hit on. But mainstream, they just need one thing to call it. So it was crypto, but then crypto is ICO, and there was a fallout there. So with Web3 being an easy way to categorize a lot of different things, when something happens in DeFi, do you see it dragging down all of the progress you're seeing maybe in DAOs or NFTs, interchangeably the same problem?
I think this might be the first year where you kind of see many parts of the ecosystem separating themselves. And even the types of builders, investors, and innovators that are attracted to different parts of the broader Web3 space are sometimes unable to even stay up to speed with the rest of the ecosystem. So I would say there's 4 main camps, and usually you have to pick 2. And those 4 camps are subcultures whereby which each of those groups have their own personalities, their own leaders, their own tribal leaders, their own sort of nuances of how they act and behave. And even though DeFi may have a lot going on, it does impact to an extent, but many of the leaders in each one of those camps, I think, digests and chooses to kind of interact and sort of respond to those changes differently. So the first camp I would say is infrastructure or low-level protocols, people contributing to things like ETH 2.0 or kind of the upgrades and a lot of the deep research. The second I would say is DeFi or the bucket whereby which all financial applications kind of fall. The third I would call NFTs around the tokenization of all forms of media. And the last one I would say is the bucket of DAOs, which is kind of not only reinventing how organizations function using smart contracts and cryptographic proofs, but also allowing for people to start to reimagine what groups of people that have a shared goal can do together with maybe an incentive that's intrinsic or not, hard and or soft. So it could be monetary, like crypto, a lot of crypto and DeFi does with money, but it can be now you can use tokens to also represent reputation, community, belonging, individualism or identity, and reputation scores, which we may see reflected in other ways, or social capital or soft power that the regular traditional world kind of uses as a way to wield power, influence, and build. Really,
I'm really curious. Given how long you've been in the ecosystem, what role do you think ConsenSys has played in the influence around Ethereum and the things that are being built on Ethereum? Like, do you think they're the main driver? Do you think the community has really adopted a lot of what's happening in the Ethereum ecosystem? Or what's your take or thoughts there? Do you all feel like you're the incubator that's like pumping out a lot of stuff in this industry? And what happens if ConsenSys or something is removed? Do you think the Ethereum ecosystem has been influenced enough to continue on?
That's a great question. I think early on, ConsenSys as a privatized company that had really sought out to build for-profit organizations that use the protocol for a variety of uses, both enterprise and bleeding edge kind of new innovations and experiments, that it was instrumental in really helping to establish that. But we weren't the only ones. I think Ethereum and its history having, a number of early contributors and founders, whereby which there isn't always necessarily an agreement as to what role that each individual played, was actually maybe one of the most positive things to happen for Ethereum, because many of those individuals ended up deciding, I would like to build a blockchain of blockchains, or I would like to build an improvement on the consensus mechanism, or I would like to build something that is much more interoperable with the existing world. And so ConsenSys' role, I think, in helping to establish many of the tools and products that help to make the world and make Ethereum more easily adopted, is absolutely one of the main drivers as to why it's still here. and why it still continues to attract the most amount of trusted developers in the space. And when you think about kind of some of the products that they launched with, it was born out of problems and the identification of those problems. When you didn't have an easy way to build, or some of the most basic tools to start around a new language like Solidity, Truffle was born. When you didn't have a non-custodial wallet where you didn't have to trust Poloniex or one of these early sort of BitMEX or one of these other earlier exchanges, MetaMask was born. And a lot of those years, the first few years of things like Infura, where running a node was very cumbersome, they said, maybe there's an easier way and we can provide a little bit of value, even though we know the end users should have maximum sovereignty. Perhaps in the interim, we can still provide some solutions along the way. And so without even just those three examples, I think the space would have been hamstrung and probably in certain ways gone the way of some of the zombie chains, or chains whereby which they promised a lot, but then years and years later, whether or not it was bull or bear market dictated really whether or not the spaces would have capital to deploy into those companies. So ConsenSys's role, I think, still remains steadfast. So even in the more recent sort of market corrections, we're a company that prides itself on financing companies and individuals that had pivoted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. We had people and individuals that contributed from project to project, and we're excited to continue to invest in companies, even with market corrections, very poor macros, rising interest rates, geopolitical risk. I think a lot of other people see that and see like a 60, 70, 80% drop and all of the poor macros and are running for the hills. Whereas if you look into our company, I think the vast majority of individuals have been really steadfast and are very interested in continuing to build, irregardless as to what the price of ETH is, irregardless as to what is happening around, because we believe when you zoom out, the long-term vision will be realized and that many people will benefit from Ethereum and also its related and sister-based technologies.
Man, that's such a good answer. I feel like that's like, was it we're all going to make it type of answer as well too, of like, we see the big vision, just keep building. I'm kind of curious, like, what are some of the startups or companies probably in the past that like were just ahead of their time? Like, it seems like everyone's building, and this is when, especially during bear markets, people talk about, oh, we're heads down building, it's all going to come back. But obviously timing is everything. Are there a couple of companies that y'all have interacted with in the past where it's like brilliant idea, it's just the wrong time, and you're starting to see like some of those theses start to take off now?
Oh my goodness. The trail of the dead is long. And, if you were to ask each of these contributors, we've tried to embrace obviously permissionless innovation and use internal sort of processes around committees, like the resource allocation circle, to actually help make these decisions on where capital should go. But yeah, we've got lots of examples of where it was just a little too early. One was called Bounties Network, and it was basically just using crypto economic incentives to build a marketplace around almost any incentive. So a generalized protocol whereby which anyone could set up a Fiverr, a Craigslist like organization and incentivize people to do the things that you would want them to do. Now, obviously, they can, when it's a generalized protocol, it gets a little scary when you're saying, hey, build this marketplace. A lot of people in the last decade or so were much more used to a curated user experience and at least having minimum scaffolding like a Craigslist, like a directory and front page that you have never seen really change over the last couple decades. And people were just not really ready to do that, to spend their own money, to have automation. Many of the other tools and even the scaling and infrastructural elements just were not quite there. And I think the main reason why it didn't succeed at the time was people were just not ready to think that way or behave that way. you had a lot of people that were just very happy to rely on existing centralized systems to provide insurance, arbitration, validation of reputation. There's a lot of benefits to using a centralized organization that Foundries Network didn't necessarily have, which is why I think Mark and Simona and some of the original founders really also had built systems and wanted to build protocols to help with arbitration, to help with mediation when someone did wrong and someone didn't get their goods or services, or when someone did right and that reputation should be transferred. Another example is Solarius, which was working with some of the biggest names in Hollywood, some amazing blue chip IP that we all still enjoy in movies and on demand and even in games. And that team and company really was trying to decentralize the beginning, both the creation of value and the sharing of value in a fantasy / sci-fi genre, whereby which you could co-create something like a Star Wars or something like a Disney. So what we're now seeing with Yuga and Bored Apes and this proliferation of a bunch of various characters drawing an alliance to build a metaverse and a game, Solarius was trying to do. And we were talking and building, but as the bear market hit, the team decided to put it on ice and focus on things that were much more near term or had a higher likelihood of succeeding. So those are a couple that didn't quite work out, but we really love those founders. Igor and the broader Solarius team ended up still working in the space. Actually, most people that, even though they may not be working on the product or service that they were building before, have still stayed in the space and still stayed committed to working in the space. Which is why we were so excited to kind of back founders pivot after pivot. And we hope to still be walking with them even later on. And even as ConsenSys and Mesh really worked through the messiness of this incubator V1 strategy of incubate indefinitely. We've tried to be as meritocratic as possible in helping each of the companies realize what they originally sought after to do.
I even think too, I think it was Ujo Music. Was that part of the portfolio? Like, absolutely. I think what they were doing with like music and NFTs was like another one that was well ahead of its time. And now you're seeing all this conversation, at least the past year, about music NFTs as well. And I was just like, they were like the frontier. Like, they really pioneered a lot.
Yeah. Jesse, Jack, Kyle, bunch of the team, they're still in the space. We're so happy that many of them ended up joining Noise DAO, which was the music-focused investment DAO that Tribute helped to seed, and even had Jesse speak at the conference that he helped to start, Ethereum, a few months back. And music may not have been ready to tokenize, stems or other aspect or samples even of a lot of songs before, but it seems as though people are now at the blue chip, level of people like Timberland, partnering with new projects like Atom Car Club or Altered State Machines and Fluff World. Many major producers and individuals are starting to get involved. So it may be now's the time that music finally hits, because it's a lower lift in terms of what might need to be done in terms of tokenization and actually getting all the parties that are involved in producing an audio piece of content on board.
So it's funny, one, just the names in this space are great. A lot of the ones you just threw out are just so good. As you were sharing before about some of the projects that were ahead of their time and either made it or didn't make it, I'm reminded of the sentiment from back 2016, 2017, where it was blockchain is a solution looking for a problem. And that might be kind of a trauma-inducing statement, but what you just shared, it's more of a venture mindset. So maybe some of the chains that were single purpose and ran out of funding, that's like any other startup that has a purpose but runs out of funding and then it's gone. But the well-funded ones are able to say, okay, no, we have a vision for something. And when we look at the space, And what ConsenSys did was, you don't yet know how to apply this technology from today to the vision we have tomorrow, because we need Truffle, because we need MetaMask. We need all of these things because we're still building the foundation. And so when I think of ConsenSys in your role, you've helped kind of answer the criticism, which is blockchain is a solution looking for a problem. It was like, no, we see it. We just actually have to get there. So that was a good trip down memory lane.
Well, I'm curious to kind of move into, Shawn, you've been in this ecosystem or the crypto world for a while. And then TJ and I have also kind of been in this space in a long time as well too. And we spend a lot of time talking about trying to make sense of the past 2 years, 2020 to 2022, and just the wild roller coaster ride that it's been, from just the market being crazy to, investment DAOs to summer DeFi to NFTs. Like, when you think back to these past 2 years and being in this space before then, and then also kind of after at this point, how do you make sense, or like what are some of the highlights or milestones, or even some of the things that you've thought a lot about that's come out of the past 2 years?
That's a great question.
Like, did you jump on the summer DeFi, or were you all in investment DAOs early on? Like, which rabbit holes did you decide to go down? And which ones did you wish you went down?
Pretty much all of them. I feel like that's kind of the crazy part. I see part of my job is experimentation and being aware of the most interesting and innovative use cases. And, the last 2 years specifically, I would say, seeing the food token boom during DeFi Summer 1.0, and even just many of the adjustments of how NFTs really took over, or really started to take the majority of end users, and the total amount of ETH burned, which is kind of a proxy for where a lot of the most rabid behavior is. And then even more recently, some of these bigger blowups like Terra Luna, and this being a multi-billion-dollar protocol and product that many people relied on and thought that it had figured out something called algorithmic stablecoins, or another way to put it is, how do you build software that would replace the Fed, which is kind of a crazy thought, like software that replaces the Federal Reserve. And so it's hard to say, because it really does feel like dog years in crypto, that even though, regular time may pass, in a week, you might see, not just the same level of news, but news that changes and actually shakes the very foundations of what others rely on to build, which is what I would say is the contrast to Web 2. I mean, Web 2 probably still has more users, many more startups launching, even more capital going into it. And so as a subset, crypto still hasn't, won the market share in any of those. But what I think is different is that the changes that happen in crypto, even though there are fewer of them, and even though it does feel like a continuous stream of changes, those changes end up deeply impacting all the other tribes and other buckets of innovation. So when things like Terra Luna happen, you invite some of the other existential risks, or execution risks, or macro risks that maybe you didn't really think about if you were an NFT focused founder before. So I would say every quarter there's something new, whether it was stable coins as innovation, or lending, borrowing, or even thinking about tokenized derivatives, or daisy chained derivatives, and using software to automate all of these permission systems. All of those things in the DeFi bucket really did start to touch on NFTs innovations around different standards of how media could be represented, and have opened up conversations around what commercial license uses actually do you have when you own a Bored Ape or a Doodle or a CryptoPunk, which, the commercial rights and usage of media assets, whether or not they were a JPEG or an audio file, weren't really top of mind questions when we were going through a lot of the DeFi lessons and triumphs and failures. Now I think we're going to see the similar sort of experimentation happen with DAOs. So organizations that start to rely on software for people to organize and achieve a goal together, you're probably going to see a ton of failure, and maybe it follows the power law, maybe it doesn't. But now we're living through this new place where it's like everyone says that they want control and governance and the ability to participate, but I don't think most people have had the luxury of actually being able to step back and say, oh wow, if I actually had to make part of the decision for every product and service that I consume on a daily basis, that becomes information overload, and maybe that isn't such a good idea. And maybe I should have software that emphasizes delegation, or ensuring that people with higher reputation scores that know how to build a specific product or service probably should have a greater weight of decision-making power to ensure that the products and services that I consume on a daily basis are of a certain level of quality, which is similar to that of how we rely on the federal government around the FDA or energy, or even like regulating commodities. So yeah, those are definitely things that which I see that are analogous, but I definitely don't necessarily see them as things that will slow down in the future. I see them as things that will continue to like impact and change each bucket as the space grows.
On the last topic of decentralized governance, there's two sides to that. You've got the builder's perspective and then the community. I'm just curious, which one is more idealistic in the sense that everything's purely decentralized, make a decision on everything, versus those that say, okay, in order to move forward, we need to delegate. Which side's more idealistic?
That's a great question. I don't know if it's either. I feel like it also depends on what is the goal, like what is the thing that which those groups are trying to accomplish. You take an example like Moonbirds as an NFT project, and that team building in public, right? Trying their best to communicate proactively to their audience and interested stakeholders very early on, and how they want to progressively move towards decentralization, maybe use a DAO, maybe start to use voting. But they know at the very beginning that leadership still needs to be in the mix, and also at the heart of what initially gets decided. Because even if it was to say that it wanted to be a community first project without starting some of those votes, or allowing for there to be some of that interaction, I don't think they would get the same result. So I think a lot of it is a balance of the two, because the language that we're using, a lot of people are saying, oh, it's progressive decentralization. But decentralization of what? Because decentralization in and of itself is not necessarily the end goal, but by way of decentralization, you're able to get to some of the benefits of trustlessness, permissionlessness, like greater degrees of being able to ensure that the system won't fail. And so yeah, I think there are lots of ways to do it, and there's probably not going to be one. And that's also a unique aspect of ConsenSys, because we've always taken this sort of more measured approach where we think centralized regulated approaches might actually bring some new users to the table. And maybe it's not just about the narrative of we have to annihilate all the banks because those banks are also made up of people, right? And those people are also mini organizations, and perhaps those individuals contributing to the solution is a faster way to get to adoption versus the Web2 dynamics of kind of finding an enemy in order to solidify your movement. I guess that's how I would not answer your question.
Well, I think it brings up, at least on the community side, almost every project, whether it's DeFi, NFT, membership DAOs, investment DAOs, they all will put and say publicly, we will win if the community wins. Or, this project is going to go up as long as the community buys in and is all in on what we're kind of doing, and we're all going to make it, so to speak. And I'm kind of curious to hear, like, how does one in this space actually build meaningful community? What does community even mean when it feels like it's so much of a tagline now that it feels almost overused? Because the reality, especially right now, is that we're not all going to make it. Some people, like in Luna, for example, were left holding the bag. And it's just really fascinating that there's this promise of the community is going to come together. Have you thought much about community? What's kind of your take? What do you try to tell founders or even in the DAOs that you've participated in? How do you build meaningful community?
Absolutely. We're obsessed with this question. Obsessed with it because at the heart of where we end up, I think ConsenSys ultimately puts the community above everything else. I think that is sown by way of our founder, Joe. And Joe wanting to run a company and a system and a collection of entities that really embraces that ensures that those that have contributed the most meritocratically get rewarded, and that those that have been a part of the ecosystem always have a seat at the table, always have the ability to grab the microphone and share what their real thoughts are, being really censorship resistant. And that sort of leadership does not really happen in every company, right? That sort of encouragement where you are asked to openly help make the company better and be radically sort of transparent and also open to critique. Joe has opened himself to a level of that sort of communication more than any CEO other than my last boss, Gary Vaynerchuk, that I've ever seen. And wanting to be held accountable for it at the end of the day. So I think, going back to your original question of how do you build a community, in this space, I think it's really, it can be very messy. It can be really challenging in order to build a community that lasts a very long time.
Especially when money's involved, when people feel like more like a stakeholder than just a member of a community, a two-way street, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a lot of it comes down to proactive communication around where you're going. So a lot of these NFT projects, for example, when they say WAGMI or we're all going to make it, but then don't specify what that means, it puts the integrity of the project at risk. And so if there isn't necessarily a positive outcome of what that might look like, checks and balances or stipulations as to why, a community of Moonbird holders would be able to participate in the upside and the appreciation and value. Right now, a lot of that's happening by way of speculation. Now, I think in the future, as people start to see these things as programmable and the ability to put these things on chain in a cryptographic, verifiable, trust minimized manner. I mean, all those things, all that jargon really is just to say that you're able to do it and not necessarily have to say and trust on someone's best intentions. And I really look forward to people being able to say, hey, I bought this, but your roadmap and what you said you would deliver off of this IP is tied to the value there. So to me, like the thesis around DAOs Like, why would you invest in DAOs if you're a venture investor? The thesis really is that by ensuring the contributors and members that help to provide the greatest amount of value own the majority of the company over time, that there will be multiples greater of an outcome than just a centralized company. And that's it. I mean, that by believing that you would invest in DAOs and ensure that DAOs provide more ownership and direct upside to those that contributed the most value, that the outcome will be 100x, 1,000x greater than a centralized organization. That's the hope. That's the hope that in building a community and rallying a community around a particular cause or a particular goal, that those promises can be held accountable through software. So right now we're watching Terra Luna and UST kind of play out, but perhaps arbitration and some of the open questions around their treasury and the $3.5 billion in Bitcoin that they had purchased previously, perhaps that was placed into a smart contract, or portions of it were placed into a smart contract, and based upon the outcomes of what the company had did or milestones that it had accomplished, there would be basically an automatic way for those contributors and investors to be paid out. And right now, you kind of have to trust. And there's people publicly using social capital. So CZ, the CEO of Binance and founder of one of the most successful conglomerates out there, basically tweeted out this morning that we're publicly committed to the idea that the long tail holders of UST and Luna get paid out before us as preferred shareholding investors like Binance, which is pretty incredible. You would never hear the CEO of Coke or Disney or Mondelez or Unilever ever say, because their shareholders are not the same thing as the users of those products. But here you have a CEO saying, preferred shares usually means you get paid first. Preferred shares usually means you get paid before even the founders, because you took on the risk. You financed the business, and the order of operations and the order of cascading successes or failures, usually they get paid out first too. Right? If you have preferred shares and before you hit a certain amount, that you end up eating first. And so now we're into this place where operators are becoming more like founders, and operators are becoming more like investors. Investors are also becoming more like founders, whereby which the power dynamic is becoming more and more equal. And perhaps if you are a large financial institution like a Binance, one could argue that they should have been more responsible with vetting this project or seeing these existential risks. And maybe this is their way of taking responsibility for the cataclysmic kind of failure and unwinding and death spiral that we've kind of witnessed over the last week.
So that's a voluntary decision by Binance. As far as where we're going, do you see investors and community members actually requiring something like that?
I actually see more and more founders, I would say even just as recent as a year ago, that let's say you launched a ERC20 token or an NFT, and some founders and investors, once the protocol or company had launched their token, there was no holding period, there was no vesting. And it's only now that I feel like it's become more market standard, whereby which you might have saw 4-year vests, 5-year vests, like in traditional private market equity cap tables, whereby which founders and investors are starting to move in that direction and say, this token may be liquid on an exchange, and individuals can buy and sell at their own will, but we are publicly committing to holding this token, even though we own a lot of it, until 2023, 2024, 2025. And that sort of self-accountability and proactive communication is the reason why we have more trust in certain companies and initiatives than others. So Gitcoin being a prime example of a company that had proactively communicated to their users and their holders that the value of everything, that the value and totality of the company's long-term efforts would accrue to the token and not to the cap table, which, that sort of principle being aligned in where you think things are going is very murky with a lot of Web3 companies. Founders, investors, and end users are not always clear as to where the value will accrue. And if you're not aligned in principle, and if there's not even a single person asking the question, then I think that's a recipe for disappointment, because there's going to be lots of people that expect one thing, but then are a recipient of another outcome.
That's really fascinating, because I think when you think of crypto, you think the price is always going to go up and we're all going to make a bunch of money and we're going to get Lambos. But what you kind of described in some ways, like with investors in Web3 who like really want to be in the space, there's almost a little bit more of a social or mission mindset into, are we aligned with the founders and what kind of community and outcomes that they're trying to create, and are thinking of new like financial strategies as well too, to benefit like all parties that are kind of involved in the proper way in which contribution kind of happens. Like, do you see investors or even like people funding Web3 projects to be more mission or social minded with the founders and the ethos of the company? Or do you think there's still the financial like 100x returns that people are most focused on?
I think it's both. I don't think you can prevent.
So we can make money and do good at the same time is what you're telling me.
Yes.
That's the best.
That's the best.
That's a win-win.
That's the best. I feel like the meme of like, degens or degenerates or people that ape into a token before doing any sort of diligence, is just a derivative of the subculture that we've seen with Wall Street Bets and AMC and everything that we've witnessed through Doge and even the most outspoken public market characters like Elon. And I think in contrast, you may see crypto people. Yes, there are people that are degens, but there's also regens. There's regenerates. There's people that are looking to use this technology in a way to actually accomplish environmental, social, and governance improvements upon how systems can work, and ensure to keep their leaders accountable, and ensure that every product and service that you buy reinforces their own personal principles and values, which eventually maybe all things become tokenized, and maybe there's a way to hold these things and I think approaches more accountable to what they hope to accomplish in the very end.
That's cool. Well, we are in the middle of the market kind of correcting in some way after all the Terra stuff. Everyone on Twitter is talking about now's the time to be building. We've got a ConsenSys conference coming up, not associated with your ConsenSys, but a CoinDesk ConsenSys. NFT NYC is coming up. What are some of the weird rabbit holes do you think you'll find yourself in this period of people talking about building? Like what are some of the things that are staying interesting to you right now?
This is the best time to join. I can't emphasize, after living the last bear market, that I would say over the last year and a half, the conferences have gotten to the point where you have so many opportunistic builders and investors that are kind of like fair weather fans, right? They're rooting for the Lakers or the Knicks, or the Warriors when they're doing well. But during those rebuilding years, to use a sports analogy, when Clay is rehabilitating his his whole body to be able to execute, I think that's when you see a lot of the best builders come out of the woodwork. And then the conferences and the events and the hackathons end up really only attracting true believers and people that actually see the technology for what it possibly could be, And in my opinion, I feel like those years when we went to some of the marquee events like DevCon, which is usually the annual conference that Ethereans and builders from around the world um, gather and share their latest and greatest, but we haven't had one in 3 years. So the last one was in Osaka. Before that was in um, Prague. And before that, it's visited places like Shanghai and London and Berlin. Um, I think DevCon is the event in the fall. It's going to be in Bogota, Colombia. So this is the first time they've ever gone to South America, and that might be the most valuable and important event of the year, because that will be probably a few months right after Ethereum's merge, which is the biggest upgrade that we've seen in the history of that protocol's life. So very interested in that. And then also I would say NFT NYC is the other one that I'm most interested in, because NFTs to me have become the front end interface to mass adoption.
Yeah.
I think the hope of people kind of buying and selling thousands of tokens versus buying NFTs, it just seems like a much more superior and elegant way for someone to get involved in the space and not have to understand economics, 301, and what it takes to run and sustain a microeconomy every time they want to buy a token. It doesn't seem like it's gonna be a recipe for success. So NFTs seem to be the way, or the gway.
I was in Discord this morning in one of the DAOs I'm a part of, and it's a token gated DAO, and they were literally talking about perhaps transitioning to an NFT gated token DAO. And it's just like how to reverse that effect, just because like NFTs have taken off and the practical use case for membership has really become very obvious to people now as well too. So it's really interesting to see how people might reverse having a token first mindset to an NFT first mindset, because it does seem perhaps easier to bring in newcomers. I mean, I think Link's DAO kind of demonstrated how many new people they were able to bring in to their DAO through an NFT. So it'll be interesting to see what the ladder to getting into this industry really will look like, because DeFi is hard to like wrap your head around. I mean, TJ, you've been studying it for a long time, and that's not the first place to go to start, is to leverage all your coins up in DeFi. It might be best just to buy an NFT and test the waters that way. Cool. Well, Shawn, we really appreciate you kind of sharing your wealth of knowledge with us and to Bryce's listeners on More Than Profit for sure. Perhaps there are listeners now too. But anything else that we didn't talk about or might have missed that is probably important for people to know about, or even like, we talked a lot about some big subjects. Are there a couple of like resources or places to go to like dive deeper that you would recommend?
Yes. Absolutely. There are so many. I would say,
besides following you on Twitter.
I have really enjoyed obviously the public discourse in the Twitter and Discord ecosystems. I feel like the best way is learn by doing, and oftentimes because it's a subject that's very multifaceted, I would try to find that small group of friends to actually learn alongside with and experiment with, because a lot of what we're talking about is a new way of interacting with companies and even understanding what a protocol is. So find a group of friends, build a mastermind group is what some people like to call them, and I would say key ways that I would encourage people to learn are a combination of doing and then also a high level look through some key books. I would say things like Blockchain Revolution, In the Age of Cryptocurrency, I really enjoyed, as understanding what kind of the broad impact of these technologies might actually bring you to. And then even certain books like The Sovereign Individual, which talks about the implications of when nation states might actually compete for us as citizens. And I would also say newsletters and digests from some of the larger DeFi and crypto publishers, like NFT Now, I think is fantastic, especially when you're talking about end users and end consumers, understanding how crypto and Web3 and blockchains have touched just pop cultures and the zeitgeist. And another one I would say is Decrypt. And Decrypt has an amazing podcast, amazing newsletter, whereby which they're talking about a lot of insider knowledge, but they're also talking about in a way that actually is very, very digestible for general audiences. So if you enjoy keeping up with the latest, those newsletters are great. And then if you want to take a full step back and say, hey, how do I think about this in terms of systems and implications? Those books are great. And then I think there's no better way to make it really, really get fully baked than doing it with your friends in a mastermind group.
That's awesome. So if you had a magic wand, what would be the one tool that you need right now to solve your problems in this space?
Oh my goodness.
Like, is there like one on your wish list that you're just like, man, I really need someone to build this?
Maybe one of those blinkers from Men in Black where you're just I would say something that a lot of people usually don't see as a separate product, but it gets bundled in all of your internet logins is better identity solutions, flexible ones. I would say identity solutions and getting to multiple standards that people accept open up the doors for software to power use cases and things that you just can't do today. So with a better identity solution, whether it's the use of an NFT itself, or a soul-bound NFT is what some might call it, or decentralized identities and verifiable credentials as proposed by the W3C, public nonprofits that are really helping to set internet standards. These are things that we don't really think about on a day-to-day. I think if I could wave a wand and make, Coinbase, OpenSea, Circle, ConsenSys, MetaMask, like all agree on a standard, that would open up millions of use cases that would be much more focused on providing value to the end user and individual than it would be for the institutions. So under collateralized loans. So maybe it's just your credit score based off of data that you own across the internet versus old school credit markets and credit reports that are quite antiquated. So that's one example, but DIDs and VCs or NFTs as better identity primitives can make dynamic social networks. So maybe the social network pops up for the week because we're on a retreat, then disappears later, and the end users control that data on an ongoing basis. So that's what I would wish for.
To connect with Shawn, follow him on Twitter at SHACHENG. And if you're curious about either of our guest hosts, check them out on Twitter as well, or go to hddn.vc and accessventures.org/blockchain to learn more. As always, stay up to date by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, drop us a review so others can find us as well. More Than Profit is a production of Access Ventures. Direction, design, and editing is done by Render, a public benefit innovation as a services studio in Louisville, Kentucky. To learn more about their work, check out workwithrender.com. As always, I'm Bryce Butler with Access Ventures. Thanks for listening.